Hello everyone! Today I'm going to share a brand new story on my channel, The Twists of Life.
Margaret Maggie Collins lived in a quiet Midwestern town where the days passed slowly, and everyone knew everyone else's business. The town sat far from highways and hospitals, surrounded by fields that stretched flat and empty to the horizon. Maggie had grown up here, inherited her small wooden house from her grandmother, and believed she understood what this place could offer and what it never would. Until her marriage, it had been enough. She was only 20 when she married Brian Collins. Back then, Maggie was healthy and bright, the kind of woman who laughed easily and moved through life with warmth and purpose. She worked at the local library, walked home along the same gravel roads each evening, and slept soundly at night. People remembered her smile. They remembered her energy. Within the first year of marriage, that woman seemed to disappear. It began with a cough that never quite went away. At first it was easy to dismiss, just something lingering from a cold, maybe the dust from the old house. But the cough grew deeper, harsher, stealing her breath in the middle of sentences and waking her at night. Weakness followed, then weight loss. Her cheeks hollowed, her clothes hung loosely from her frame, and her eyes lost their shine. Brian noticed the changes, but not with concern. His patience thinned as Maggie grew quieter and slower. He complained about the noise of her coughing, about the way she no longer kept the house the way she once did. He spoke to her sharply, as if her illness were an inconvenience, a personal failure. At night, when Maggie lay awake fighting for air, the house felt unbearably silent. The isolation of the town pressed in on her, the walls closing tighter with each shallow breath. This was not the marriage she had imagined. It did not feel safe. It did not feel kind. It felt, even then, like something slowly killing her. To the rest of the town, Brian Collins was a man worth admiring. He carried himself with confidence, spoke loudly and often, and never missed an opportunity to remind people how much they relied on him. He worked as a delivery driver, hauling bread from the local bakery to small grocery stores scattered across the county. Every morning, his truck rumbled through town before sunrise, and by noon he was already back, stretching his arms as if he had carried the weight of the entire place on his shoulders. "Without me, you'd all be eating empty plates," he liked to joke. People laughed. They nodded. They believed him. Brian talked freely about his future. He told anyone who would listen that he owned an apartment in the city, rented out for now, waiting for the right moment to upgrade to something bigger. He spoke of money he was saving, of plans to eventually move Maggie away from the quiet town, once everything was in place. His words painted a picture of ambition and success, and the townspeople admired him for it. Maggie never corrected him. She stood beside Brian in public, smiling politely, letting his stories unfold. She did not crave the city or a larger house. The small home her grandmother had left her was enough. Its creaking floors and narrow rooms felt familiar, safe. She believed a simple life could still be a good one. At home, Brian was different. The charm faded once the door closed behind him. His voice sharpened, his patience vanished, and his pride turned brittle. He expected meals ready and silence when he wanted rest. Maggie learned quickly that the man admired by the town was not the man she lived with. To everyone else, Brian Collins was impressive. To Maggie, he was becoming something else entirely. The nights were the worst. As soon as darkness settled over the town and the house fell quiet, Maggie's body seemed to turn against her. The cough that lingered during the day became violent after midnight, tearing through her chest in uncontrollable fits. Her nose clogged completely, forcing her to breathe through her mouth, each shallow breath scraping her throat raw. Sometimes she woke suddenly, gasping, her heart racing as if she had been pulled from deep water. Brian did not wake with concern. He woke with anger. Every cough, every restless movement irritated him. He complained that he had to get up early, that her noise kept him from sleeping. One night, after she startled awake struggling to breathe, he snapped and told her to leave the bedroom. Maggie did not argue. She gathered a blanket and moved to the couch in the other room, embarrassed and exhausted. Strangely, the air felt different there. Her breathing eased. The coughing softened, losing its sharp edge. She still felt weak, still miserable. But for the first time in weeks, she managed to sleep for a few uninterrupted hours. Maggie noticed the change but did not question it. She was too tired to search for reasons. She was grateful simply to breathe. Each morning, she forced herself up and went to work at the local library. The job was quiet and undemanding, but even that required more strength than she had left. She stamped returns, filed cards, and answered polite questions, all while fighting dizziness and a constant ache behind her eyes. By the time she walked home in the evening, her legs trembled beneath her. New symptoms followed. Her eyes grew red and irritated, burning as if filled with sand. Then a rash appeared across her back and arms, angry red patches that itched and spread without warning. Maggie stood in front of the mirror, barely recognizing the frail woman staring back. Something was wrong, and it was getting worse. Not long after Maggie was sent from the bedroom, Brian began to disappear altogether. He started mentioning night shifts, explaining that the bakery needed bread on the shelves earlier and earlier. Some nights he didn't come home at all. Other times, he arrived near dawn, smelling of cold air and exhaustion, dropping into bed without a word. He avoided Maggie's questions with vague answers, his eyes already closed. Around town, people talked. Someone mentioned seeing Brian in the neighboring city, not alone. Another claimed he'd been spotted with a woman Maggie didn't recognize, well-dressed, unfamiliar, clearly not from their small town. The rumors reached Maggie through hesitant voices and careful pauses, but no one ever said anything directly. They watched her instead, measuring how much she could bear. One evening, while sorting laundry, Maggie noticed a faint smear of lipstick on one of Brian's shirts. She stared at it for a long time, her chest tightening. When she mentioned it, Brian reacted quickly. Too quickly. He laughed it off, said she must be mistaken, then announced he would handle his own laundry from now on. "You're already sick," he told her. "I don't want you touching anything unnecessary." From that day on, he washed only his shirts. Maggie continued to clean everything else, too weak to argue, too tired to connect the pieces forming in her mind. Even suspicion required energy, and she had none left to spare. As Brian spent more nights away, the house grew quieter. Maggie lay alone, listening to the walls creak, her thoughts circling fears she didn't dare name. Whatever was happening, she felt herself being left behind, physically, emotionally, completely. She had never felt so alone. By late winter, Maggie could no longer pretend she was getting better. Most days, she stayed in bed, too weak to stand without swaying. Even walking to the bathroom left her breathless, her heart pounding as if she had run for miles. The cough drained what little strength remained, leaving her exhausted and trembling beneath the blankets. Food barely stayed down. Her body seemed to be shrinking, retreating from the world one painful inch at a time. Brian stopped hiding his resentment. He no longer lowered his voice when he complained. He spoke sharply, openly, as if Maggie were no longer fully there to hear him. Sometimes, when she coughed too long or asked for help, his face tightened with irritation, and he muttered words she tried not to absorb. Once, in a moment that burned itself into her memory, he snapped that it would be easier for everyone if she just didn't wake up one morning. That was when the truth began to surface. The stories Brian had told the town unraveled piece by piece. There was no city apartment, no rental income, no careful savings plan. Years earlier, he had lost his previous job in disgrace, fired and quietly pushed out after being caught stealing fuel and selling it off. He had fled the city with nothing but his pride and his lies. Maggie was never part of a dream. She was a solution. He married her for the house, the modest, aging home she had inherited from her grandmother. It was the only real asset either of them had. One afternoon, as Maggie lay half awake in her room, voices drifted down the hallway. Brian's voice was confident, smooth, a stranger's. Voice answered him, cautious but interested. Maggie listened as Brian described the property, explaining that he was selling half the house cheaply. He spoke casually about the other occupant. "An old woman, very sick," he said. "She won't be around much longer." There was the sound of papers shifting, then money, then agreement. Maggie lay frozen, staring at the ceiling, understanding at last that while she was dying, her husband was already selling her life away. After the voices faded and the front door closed, Maggie tried to move. She pushed herself upright, intending to reach the kitchen for water, but her legs failed her. The room tilted, darkness rushing in from the edges of her vision. She took one step, then another, before her strength gave out completely. Maggie collapsed to the floor, the impact sending a dull jolt through her fragile body. She might have stayed there for hours if not for the sound of unfamiliar footsteps. The door opened and a man she had never seen before stepped into the house. He paused when he heard the noise, then followed it down the hall. When he reached Maggie's room and saw her on the floor, his expression changed instantly, from confusion to alarm. This was not the elderly woman he had been promised. Daniel Foster knelt beside her, carefully lifting her shoulders and helping her sit up against the bed. Up close, Maggie could see concern in his eyes, sharp and focused. He asked her name, asked where it hurt, but she could barely answer. Her chest tightened, the familiar cough clawing its way back. Daniel moved quickly but calmly. He found a glass, filled it with water, and guided it to her lips. "Small sips," he said gently. Maggie obeyed without thinking. The cool water soothed her throat, easing the raw burning she had grown used to. To her surprise, the coughing slowed, then stopped altogether. She took a deeper breath than she had in days. Daniel watched her closely, noting every change. He introduced himself then, explaining that he had just purchased half the house. His voice was steady, measured, as if he were trained to observe rather than react. Maggie listened, still catching her breath, trying to understand how a stranger had suddenly appeared in her life at the moment she could no longer stand on her own. As Daniel helped her onto the bed, Maggie felt something shift inside her, subtle but undeniable. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel completely alone. Daniel did not say much that first evening, but he stayed. Over the next few days, he moved through the house with quiet purpose, helping where Maggie could no longer manage on her own. He watched her closely, how she breathed, how her color shifted, how the coughing eased whenever Brian was not around. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Eventually, Daniel told her the truth about himself. He was a physician, not a local one, and not without scars. Years earlier, a medical case had ended in tragedy, an allergic reaction that no one had anticipated. The legal battles that followed had stripped him of everything familiar. He had taken responsibility, stepped away, and rebuilt his life slowly, cautiously. Buying half the house had been meant as a fresh start, nothing more. But Maggie's condition troubled him deeply. She was noticeably better when Brian was gone, stronger, clearer. The improvement was subtle, but consistent. Daniel explained his concerns carefully, choosing his words with precision. He told Maggie she needed proper testing, tests the small town clinic could not offer. Despite her fear and weakness, Maggie agreed. Daniel drove her to the city, to a hospital where specialists listened, tested, and looked beyond the obvious. Blood work was taken. Her history was examined closely. Days later, the answer came, as unexpected as it was devastating. Maggie was suffering from a rare and severe biological allergy, not to food, not to medication, to her husband. Her immune system was reacting violently to prolonged exposure to Brian, his skin, his breath, his presence. Each night beside him had been poisoning her body. The doctors were clear. Continued exposure could have led to full anaphylactic shock. She might not have survived much longer. Maggie sat in silence as the explanation settled in. All this time, she had blamed herself, her weakness, her failure to recover. But her body had been fighting for her life, rejecting what her mind had tried to endure. The realization was overwhelming, terrifying, and freeing. It was not her imagination. It was not her fault. Her body had known what her heart had been too afraid to admit. Once Brian was gone from the house, the change in Maggie was undeniable. Her coughing eased within days. Her breathing grew deeper, steadier. Color returned to her face, slowly at first, then with surprising speed. She began to eat again, small meals that stayed down, her body no longer rejecting itself. Strength followed. She could stand without swaying, walk across the room without needing to stop, sleep through the night without waking in panic. With her health, something else returned as well: her spirit. Maggie laughed again, softly at first, as if unsure whether she was allowed. She spoke more. She moved through the house with growing confidence, reclaiming rooms that had felt like cages. Daniel remained close, helping when she asked, stepping back when she did not. He never rushed her, never pushed. His presence was steady, respectful, offering safety without demand. In time, Daniel told her how he felt. He chose a quiet evening, no speeches, no pressure. When he asked her to marry him, Maggie's first response was not joy or fear, but hesitation. She reminded him, gently, that she was still legally married. The past had not yet been fully closed. Daniel accepted this without disappointment. The divorce moved forward in Brian's absence. Notices were sent. Hearings were scheduled. Brian never appeared. After the required proceedings, the marriage that had nearly killed her was dissolved, without his participation, without drama. Only then did Maggie say yes. They married quietly, without celebration or spectacle. No audience, no promises shouted aloud. Just two people choosing a life that did not require suffering to survive. For Maggie, happiness no longer felt fragile. It felt earned. Brian returned months later, long after the house had settled into a new rhythm. He arrived unannounced, standing on the porch in a worn jacket that no longer fit him properly. His face was unshaven, his hair uneven, his posture slouched with exhaustion and bitterness. The confidence he once carried so loudly through town was gone, replaced by impatience and need. He knocked as if he still belonged there. Brian had done the math in his head. Enough time had passed. Maggie, sick and alone, could not have lasted long. He had come to claim what he believed was rightfully his, the remaining half of the house. Once it was signed over, he planned to sell and disappear for good. Daniel opened the door. Brian frowned, irritated, already preparing his argument. He began speaking before fully looking past him, explaining why he was there, how the paperwork should have been finished by now. His words stopped abruptly when a movement behind Daniel caught his attention. Maggie stepped into view. She looked nothing like the woman Brian remembered. Her skin was warm with color, her posture upright and steady. She wore loose clothing that no longer hid illness, but life. When she rested a hand protectively against her stomach, the meaning was unmistakable. Brian stared, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Daniel stepped forward, placing himself between them. His voice was calm, controlled, and final. He told Brian the house was no longer his concern. Maggie was alive. She was well, and she was protected. Brian tried to speak, to protest, to reclaim authority that no longer existed. But there was nothing left to argue. The lies that once carried him had lost their power. Without another word, he backed away from the door. His defeat was quiet, complete, and deeply humiliating. Brian left the way he had lived, empty-handed. In the months that followed, the house grew quiet in a different way. There was no tension in the walls now, no fear lingering in the corners. The silence no longer pressed down on Maggie's chest. It felt open, breathable, safe. Mornings came gently, without coughing fits or dread. Nights passed without struggle. For the first time in a long while, Maggie slept deeply, her body finally at rest. She often thought about how close she had come to disappearing without ever understanding why. Illness had nearly taken her life, yet it had also saved it. What had once felt like weakness revealed itself as warning. Her body had been speaking long before she was able to listen, reacting, resisting, fighting against something that was slowly destroying her. While her mind had tried to endure, to adapt, to survive at any cost, her body had refused. Looking back, Maggie no longer felt shame for how long it took her to see the truth. She understood now that endurance is not the same as strength. Sometimes staying is not loyalty. Sometimes love does not heal, it harms. With Daniel, her life felt grounded in honesty. There were no performances, no expectations she had to meet to deserve care. Their future was not built on promises or appearances, but on mutual respect and safety. It was quiet. It was real. Maggie learned to trust herself again, to notice when something felt wrong, to listen when her body tightened or recoiled, instead of forcing herself to ignore it. Self-preservation, she realized, was not selfish. It was necessary. Her story did not end with dramatic revenge or loud justice. It ended with dignity, with survival, with the simple, powerful act of choosing a life that did not require suffering. And for those listening, Maggie's journey carries a question worth asking. Have you ever ignored the signs because you thought you had to endure? Have you ever stayed where your body was begging you to leave? If this story resonated with you, take a moment to share your thoughts. Speak about healing, about boundaries, about second chances, especially the ones we give ourselves.